On the eve of the World Water Day, the United Nations offered a sobering statistic. According to a recent study, more people on Earth have access to cellular phones than they do flush toilets. Now initially you may think that stinks, but in reality there are some incredible insights that can be gained. Take a look at these three graphs. The first graph shows world population over the past 350 years. It wasn't until 1800 that we reached a billion, but now we're exploding at adding a billion people every 12 to 15 years. The second graph shows cell phone subscriptions for the past 30 years. We are now adding a billion subscriptions every 3 years. The third graph combines these two, and it shows that cell phones will soon pass the world's population. Now that doesn't mean that everybody on Earth has a cell phone, but what it does mean is the world that we're living in today is radically different than the world of just 25 years ago. Take, for example, the Bedouins. For thousands of years, the routes that they traveled were determined by where they could get water. But now, those routes are determined by where they can get cell phone coverage. Because as long as you can reach somebody on the cell phone, you can call and have them bring you water. Well, this explosive growth of mobile phones continues to add information at a staggering proportion. Your cell phone is a small computer. My wife calls it a brain in the hand. It can store tremendous amounts of information. And the term digital footprint describes this trail of activity that comes from the text messages you send, the emails, the web pages you look at, the videos record, and the pictures that you take. All of it is adding just tremendous amounts of information that become your digital footprint. All right, so that describes the digital part. But what about the second half, orality? When I often use that term, people who are not familiar with it confuse and think I'm talking about morality or dental hygiene or even something worse. But what I found is the most simple way to explain it is to help paint this picture in your mind. If I was to ask you to define these shapes, you would most likely say that they are a triangle, a circle, and a square. And for those of us who read and write, that would make sense, because we tend to use the geometric shapes. That's a pre-reading skill. But for oral learners, and especially those who do not read and write, they think in terms of relational terms. So to them, this becomes a mountain, the sun, and a house. They think about how things relate to daily life. An oral learner defines what they see in light of what they experience and what they understand. It's estimated that over 2/3 of the world's population are oral learners. For many, they have no choice. But for those who come from literate societies, the same stat holds true. The difference is for them, it becomes a choice. Even though they can read, they choose to learn orally. Well, this preference for orality is beginning to have a profound effect on society. One of the most influential inventions that changed how we told stories was the television remote control. Many under the age of 40 have no idea what it was like to have to actually stand up, walk over, and change the knob on the television to go to a different channel. The idea of getting up just doesn't make sense. Now, it may seem that the remote was just an invention of convenience, but in reality, it was a game changer that paved the way for a rapid and wholehearted embrace of this whole idea of relational oral thinking. Prior to the remote, you typically watched a television program in a very linear fashion. When a commercial came on, you would sometimes step out of the room, but there was a constant concern that you might miss something, so you often just stayed in your chair. Well, then along comes the remote control, and the viewer was empowered. If you didn't like what you saw, boom, you'd click a button and you'd jump out to something else. You were literally transported into a whole new genre or location. You were no longer tied to a linear story. Well, this began to change even the way that our brains function. In the book Present Shock by Douglas Rushkoff, he says this: "Our society has reoriented itself to the present moment. Everything is live, real-time, and always on." He continued to explain some of the implications of this by saying, "It's why kids in school can no longer follow linear arguments, why narrative structure collapsed into reality TV, and why we can't engage in meaningful dialogue about last month's books and music, much less long-term global issues." We can find out about what's happening around the world before CNN can even assemble a news crew to get there. And even as literacy rates rise worldwide, we are becoming more oral in how we think and function. And this has major implications for how we seek to reach people for Christ and train them in their faith. So what I've established now is that we have two themes. The first theme is that we are living in a rapidly expanding digital world where our personal information produces a digital footprint. The second theme is that we live in an oral world, an orality that goes beyond the spoken word, but to a whole new way of relational thinking. Well, how do we bring these two worlds together? Digital orality, that's what this talk is about. How do we do that? Well, several years ago, Daniel Pink wrote a book called A Whole New Mind. In the book, he presented the idea that has radically shaped my thinking on this topic. He claims that we are entering into a conceptual age and describes 6 conceptual senses. This idea provides the glue that brings digital and orality together for me. It's a way of connecting your digital footprint to the world's oral learners. History has commonly taught that society has gone through a series of ages, major blocks of times where human activity was dominated by a common theme. The last half of the 20th century ushered in the information age or the digital age. And in the same way that machines transformed society, now information changes lifestyles. Well, this has brought about a subtle societal change. It's no longer what you know, it is what you do with what you know. Before the internet, the power brokers of society were the doctors, the lawyers, the politicians, and the educators. They had access to information that the rest of us didn't have. And as a result, they used that information to make decisions and to separate themselves from the masses. But today, with the abundance of information available to you at your fingertips, it's kind of leveled the playing field. It used to be only that the doctors and the pharmacists could fully explain the potential risks and side effects of a prescription medicine. But now a simple search on Google will bring you a wealth of information about the medicine you're taking. And news travels at breakneck speed. People can get a tweet about an earthquake 200 miles away, and then they feel the earthquake itself and the aftershocks a few seconds later. Well, there's a flip side to this as well. Everybody has become a reporter. We all have a voice. So how do you separate yours? How do you get your message heard in the midst of all of the noise that's around you? How do you stand out from the masses? Well, Pink goes on to explain in the conceptual age is where we take all of this information and make sense of it. It's where we put it to use. It's how your message gets noticed. It's why some ideas take off and flourish and others just simply die. It's this whole idea of what you do with what you know. Well, in the midst of the information overloaded world, people who employ and use these 6 fundamental human abilities, or conceptual senses, as Pink calls them, are the new power brokers. They're the ones that get noticed. Well, when I heard this, something clicked. I realized that these 6 senses can provide a framework on which I can help connect my digital footprint to the oral world. The 6 senses are design, story, empathy, symphony, meaning, and fun. You can use these 6 to develop the habit of asking yourself, how well is my idea, my presentation, my website, my film, my radio program, my whatever, how well is it drawing people in? How well is it drawing oral learners in? How well is it drawing oral preference learners in? Let's talk about all 6. The best way to think of design is how does it look and how does it work? Have you noticed how websites have changed over the years? Websites used to follow a very standard pattern. A top header, a left menu, a navigation bar, a right body, and a footer that contained all the legal stuff. But now you're getting sites with full-page photographs, interactive menus, a lot of white space, videos in the background, and more importantly, they look good on a mobile phone. Apple is a company that really understood design from the beginning. Clearly, their products were very sleek and they pleased the eye. But Steve Jobs was also a master of understanding the second part of the conceptual sense, and that's the idea of story. He wouldn't just give you the numbers, he would tell stories of people's lives that were changed. I had a phone conversation with Daniel Pink back in 2006, and he said that the use of story is actually something that the church kind of leads and excels in. Well, that makes sense. Jesus was the master storyteller. I can imagine that the stories that Jesus told, whether they were the sower and the seed, or the cursing of the fig tree to the shepherds and his sheep, were all stories that were born out of this relational thinking of looking at the world that was all around them and the surroundings of which Jesus found himself in. Well, there's a place for linear teaching and education, but what many teachers don't realize is that they are not connecting with probably 2/3 of their audience if that's the only method that they use, those 2/3 of the students who prefer to learn orally. Okay, to review, the first sense we've talked about is design, and we just now talked about story. The other four are empathy, sympathy, meaning, and fun. Empathy goes beyond simply telling the story and viewing it as an outsider. It's where you begin to place yourself into the story. How much does the listener feel what you're going through? How much can they relate to it? You know, on a website, you have 10 seconds to convince the visitor that you can help meet their need in their life. If you're speaking to the listener, they need to feel that you care about what they're going through. Empathy grabs at the emotions. I recently gave a talk, and I shared a story about someone who lost something that was borrowed. I asked the audience to think about a time that they borrowed something and either lost it or damaged it or failed to return it. How did they feel? How do you face a person when you've done something like that? Well, that's what we need to do with our presentations. We need to get the person involved in them. We need to have them we need to ask the questions that kind of place themselves into the story. The fourth one, symphony, is where it all comes together. You know, just like in an orchestra, if you take all of the individual instruments played by themselves, in some cases they can be quite irritating. But yet, when you combine the powerful brass and the delicate strings and the pounding percussion and the mellow wind instruments, that's what makes beautiful music. And then it's guided by a conductor who directs it in a phenomenal way and just pulls all of those pieces together. That's the idea of symphony. So where does symphony come into play with this particular process that I'm using now? How does it come together? Well, two things. First of all, I'm always reviewing the 6 senses: design, story, empathy, symphony, meaning, and fun. So I'm pulling that kind of back in. The second thing that I'm doing is I'm trying to always have you ask the question, how does this relate to the presentations that I make? How does it relate to my digital footprint? As you interact with people, places, and things, are you using these 6 senses? I don't want this to be simply about what you know. It has to be about what you do with what you know. That's how it ties together. But we need to get past symphony, design, story, empathy, symphony, and we need to get into meaning. The baby boomers were characterized by trying to be better off than their parents. We pursued wealth, power, and prestige as an end in themselves. Steve Douglas, the president of Crew, tells a story when he graduated from one of the world's most prestigious universities. And as he was walking up onto the platform to receive his degree, he felt as if each step that he was taking was asking the question, so what? Big deal. Now what? How often have we heard of a very successful person say that they spent their entire life climbing the ladder of success only to find that it was leaning on the wrong wall? Well, that's meaning. We all look for it and we all want it. But many in today's younger generation are not necessarily pursuing the dream of being better off than their parents. They are pursuing the dream of making their life count. Well, this is another area where the Christian community, again, has a head start in leading the charge. If we keep to the central message of what Jesus Christ told us, the good news, we bring meaning. But it's very important that we don't dilute the meaning by chasing irrelevant issues. So as you digitally engage people, bring some meaning. The final sense is fun. Fun can be like the flip side of meaning. We need to be careful, though, to not get so caught up in trying to make things meaningful that we fail to bring a smile or bring laughter. Medical doctor Paul McGee says, your sense of humor is one of the most powerful tools you have to make certain that your daily mood and emotional state support good health. Research is showing tremendous health benefits to laughing and having fun. I recently ran a half marathon, 13.1 miles. The course is lined with entertainment. And near the 7-mile point, there was a place where there was a bunch of high school cheerleaders that were lining the course. And they were holding up jokes and funny sayings. And it gave me a boost of energy at that point in time for the remaining 6 miles that I had left. And you can even incorporate fun into some of your projects. As you design, add a picture or a quote that will make people laugh. When you tell your story, share something funny that happened to you. Quote somebody you just met. Now, fun also doesn't always have to mean laughter. It might be better to think of it more broadly as pleasure or enjoyment. If you were giving a tribute to somebody at their funeral, it would not be appropriate to share a joke. But you could include something about that person's life that brought you a smile. So if you have a more serious topic, you can at least put people at ease, be personable, and do things that release rather than increase tension. One of the things that I'll often do when I'm working on my website, preparing content for a talk, or even being a father to my kids, is I ask the question, how am I doing with these 6 senses? How did I do today? Is the design of this presentation attractive? Did the stories I shared about Steve Douglas or Apple increase your understanding? Have I brought you in and touched you in some emotional chord? Have I taken 2 seemingly opposite ideas, digital and orality, and brought them together like a symphony? Have I conveyed the importance of pursuing meaning while you understand the need for fun? Well, the same approach of asking these questions can be used as you work in your various situations, whether it's websites, radio programs, video presentations, articles that you write, mobile training, resources you develop. When you start this process and start pulling together your thoughts, have these 6 conceptual senses in mind and look for places to build them into what you're doing. Then as you move along in your presentation, take a moment to stop and to go back and look and ask yourself, how's my design? Am I telling a story? Is empathy there, sympathy, meaning, and fun? Let's review them one more time. Design, story, empathy, symphony, meaning, and fun. If you do this, you will go a long ways in helping to connect your digital footprint to the world's 5 billion oral learners.